Powerarchy: Understanding the Psychology of Oppression for Social Transformation. Written by Melanie Joy, Ph.D. Narrated by Crowe. Introduction. If you find the mirror of the heart dull, the rust has not been cleared from its face. Rumi. I was 4 years old when I began the journey that led to the writing of this book. It was a hot summer day, and I was with my parents on my father's fishing boat, my favorite place in the world to be. And then I caught my first fish. My parents clapped and laughed and told me how proud they were, but I felt confused and distraught. I didn't understand why I couldn't share their happiness. As I watched the fish I'd pulled out of the ocean flop wildly on the floor of the boat, gasping for air, all I could feel was sadness and guilt. After that day, my father's boat, once the source of my greatest joy, became a trigger for distress. I couldn't bear to see thrashing fish being pulled off hooks and tossed into a bloody bucket to suffocate. And seafood, which had been my favorite cuisine, sickened me to the point where I could no longer eat it without vomiting. My emotions and body were reacting to a paradox that my young brain wasn't developed enough to understand. I couldn't reconcile how caring people, my own parents nonetheless, could harm others, and neither could see nor feel troubled by this contradiction. My parents instilled in me a strong commitment to practicing the golden rule, to treating others the way I'd want to be treated if I were in their position. So did my teachers, the ministers at our church, and nearly every adult who influenced my development. Yet it seemed that everywhere I turned, this supposedly highest principle was being violated, and nobody was the least bit concerned. Whether it was my father killing fish for enjoyment, movies depicting men subduing emotionally distraught women by slapping them across the face — it was the 1960s after all — or children bullying each other on the playground in plain sight of unconcerned teachers, the relational paradox I was witnessing was the same. The golden rule, a principle meant to guide the way we relate to others, was as disregarded as it was esteemed. And, most notably, this contradiction was utterly invisible. It was more than 2 decades later that I was finally able to comprehend and articulate this relational paradox, a phenomenon I'd become increasingly sensitized to over the years. I had become deeply concerned with social injustices, and I found myself confounded by the dysfunctional state of humanity that not only allowed for, but perpetrated, widespread suffering. What, I wondered, makes people turn away from, rather than challenge, atrocities? Why do some of the same people who stand on the streets demonstrating for human rights mistreat members of their own families? Why do those who claim to want a society based on the values of compassion and justice nevertheless vote and act against these values? The answers to these questions came to me after another incident involving an animal, this time in the form of a hamburger. I was 23 years old, and I'd recently eaten a beef patty that was contaminated with Campylobacter, the salmonella of the red meat world. I wound up hospitalized and on intravenous antibiotics, and after that experience I found myself too disgusted to eat meat again. In the process of learning about my new vegetarian diet, I stumbled upon information about animal agriculture. What I learned shocked and horrified me. The extent of the needless suffering endured by billions of non-human animals and the devastation to the environment was almost incomprehensible. But what disturbed me perhaps even more was that nobody I talked to about what I'd learned was willing to hear what I had to say. Their responses were nearly always along the lines of, "Don't tell me that, you'll ruin my meal," or they'd call me a radical, vegetarian, hippie propagandist. And these were my friends and family. Conscientious, rational people who were committed to helping create a more just and compassionate world, and who genuinely cared about animals. The psychology of violence and nonviolence. Wanting to understand what it was that caused people to harbor relational
Sample complete. Ready to continue?